interested to ask you is about the anti-inflammatory mechanism in psychedelics, and what implications could this have for treating conditions like Alzheimer or allergies?
So we don't understand why they're anti-inflammatory. That's a discovery my son made. He's a professor at Louisiana State University, LSU in New Orleans. That's an interesting story. He went there a year before Hurricane Katrina hit, and he was just starting his academic career. And Katrina came and destroyed the lab he was working in. It flooded everything. It took the power down. He had a minus 80 degrees Celsius freezer, and it went down. He lost everything. And so he came and lived with me for 7 months and kept doing some amount of work. But it was really a setback because he had, as a postdoctoral researcher, he had created a lot of samples that he was going to use to jumpstart his career. And that was all over. It was all gone and destroyed. They gave him an extra year to get tenure because of that. But then he went back and he decided he was going to work on psychedelics. And I had encouraged him not to do it because I said, nobody cares how these work. He was going to study how LSD works. I said, nobody gives a damn how LSD works. This is, a few years ago, 25 years ago anyway. And, but he didn't listen to me, fortunately. And he said he wanted to work on psychedelics. And he said, are there any psychedelics that are not controlled substances? Because he didn't have his license from the Drug Enforcement Administration. And it turned out that when I was a graduate student, my first patent was developing a method for making the isomers of hallucinogenic amphetamines. And so I had made a whole bunch of them. And I had some DOI, which is not a controlled substance, but it's a very potent serotonin 2A agonist. So I sent him a sample of our DOI. And there was a postdoctoral fellow who had been there. And after Katrina, a lot of the faculty left and took jobs other places. And so there was a postdoctoral fellow there who had been working on inflammation in the cardiovascular system. And he had grown up a bunch of smooth muscle cells from cardiac tissue. And he decided he didn't want to, his professor wanted him to leave and go with him to another university. But his wife was pregnant. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay there. And he saw the advertisement, the job advertisement for my son's lab, he was looking for a postdoctoral fellow. So he went to my son's lab. And of course, he was doing completely different things than my son Charles was doing. But he knew how to grow cells. And Chuck's work involved growing cells that had serotonin 2A receptors, but this guy knew how to grow cells. So he had a petri dish essentially with these rat smooth muscle cells, the cells from cardiovascular system in a rat. So he told my son, he said, well, I've got these cells growing up, and what happens with these cells is you grow them until they start bumping into each other. And then you have to use them because once they grow into each other, they change their properties. So he told my son, he said, I've got all these cells growing up. Do you have anything I could test? Because he'd been looking at anti-inflammatory drugs that blocked inflammation in the cardiovascular system, trying to prevent atherosclerosis. And my son said, he was working on psychedelics. He wasn't working on, cardiac anti-inflammatories. But then the postdoc asked him about the sample of DOI that he had. He said, well, can I put those in and see what happens? And so my son sort of laughed and said, sure, but that's a psychedelic. It's not going to have any effect. So this Chinese postdoc ran the assay and did a dose response curve. And he came back and he said, this blocked the inflammation, the model of inflammation that we get in these cells at a concentration of 20 picomolar, which is 1,000 times smaller than nanomolar. It's 1,000 times more potent than LSD in these cells. And then my son laughed and said, you must have made a mistake. You didn't weigh your sample right or something. And so then my son made his own solution up, went in and reproduced the assay and reproduced the number. So they published a paper. This was the first paper showing that DOI was a potent anti-inflammatory in this cardiac smooth muscle assay. So that's what started it. He's been working now. He's shown that he can block asthma. Asthma, you can either prevent it or block it once it's started. Looking at rat aorta, they've blocked asthma. He's been able to block or reverse asthma with these psychedelics. And so his job right now, and he has another collaborator there, they're trying to figure out, they know it's the serotonin 2A receptor that's doing it, but they don't know what the signaling mechanism is. It seems to be something else that nobody, so they're spending a lot of time now. This is his major effort, is trying to figure out how this actually produces this anti-inflammatory effect. We're actually starting a company now to try to develop anti-inflammatories based on psychedelics.